What is the media doing wrong in its coverage of this? For instance, the point you just made that I haven't seen that made elsewhere. The media has a very childlike narrative about this war, the war in Ukraine. What do you think a responsible media would be doing in terms of setting up the conflict that's happening right now in Ukraine?
Well, childlike, I think, is a fair enough description. I don't know if it still publishes, but when I was in school, there was something called the Weekly Reader, and it was dumbed down, so to speak, or made it possible for a third grade level to grasp what was being said. When the 9/11 happened, and then George W. Bush cranked up the rhetoric, there was tremendous support for it, but gradually some opposed the what was denounced as the Manichaean approach, that the world was divided into the evildoers and the good people. And so that began to get a bit of pushback, not enough, but the idea that, maybe we shouldn't look at the world completely divided into good and evil. Well, the Manichaean worldview has come back with a vengeance. And that pervades a U.S. media coverage of the war in Ukraine. And it also pervades the kind of language we get from Capitol Hill. And I think it's shameful that a lot of Democrats who are very different than Republicans on domestic issues, there's huge differences, I believe. The Republican Party is neo-fascist on domestic policies. The Democratic Party is neoliberal. It's not the same thing. We've got to stop fascism. But the difference is essentially stop at the water's edge. And when it comes to foreign policy and militarism, it's hard to see the difference between the two parties. I bring that up in one specific instance, for example, where Congressman Davidson entered an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act earlier this month. And because of the party line, the Democrats, not a single Democrat, voted for the amendment. And it was a very reasonable one, which said, we, the Congress, and according to Article 1, Section 8, United States Congress is supposed to be the locomotive for foreign policy and war. But the amendment said, we, the Congress, are insisting that we need a timeline from the administration and an explanation for what it is doing in terms of arms shipments and military involvement in the war in Ukraine. A completely reasonable request, but it broke down, it's that binary thinking. Oh, well, if the Republicans proposed it, it must be bad. So not a single Democrat voting for it. That's pretty unhinged. And it's also a metaphor because while, as I said, I think we should unequivocally condemn what Russia has been doing militarily in Ukraine, the fact is what they did and they're doing, it doesn't have valid justification, but it has an explanation. And the expansion of NATO up to the borders, such as Latvia and Estonia, the stationing of so-called ABM systems in Poland and Romania, which can be retrofitted on short notice from being so-called defensive ABM to being offensive weapons. And for many other reasons, the United States government has, as Jeffrey Sachs wrote in Financial Times right after the invasion, the United States has not engaged in diplomacy. No meaningful diplomacy, even before the invasion when people could see that the likelihood of it was increasing. So for the US government, which is a major player here, to put it mildly, to refuse to engage in genuine diplomacy then and now, it's outrageous. It's in its own way an invitation for nuclear war. And I think if you look, for instance, and I write about this in the book, when Biden gave his State of the Union address just a few days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was about 6,000 words. Not a single one of them mentioned nuclear weapons, nuclear war, the dangers of nuclear winter or a nuclear holocaust. No, just let's pretend it isn't there. That's not leadership. That's sort of head in the sand. And I think it's notable, and I'd sort of wrap up my particular point here by mentioning that Trump was terrible around nuclear weapons. He canceled the INF Treaty, and people may remember in the 1980s, the international disarmament and peace movement dragged United States into agreeing to the INF Treaty, which banned intermediate range nuclear missiles from the continent of Europe. A tremendous victory, one of the great victories of the nuclear age for the international peace movement. There were huge demonstrations, including in Central Park, 1 million people in 1982, Greenham Common in England, in Germany, elsewhere. Great victory. So Trump cancels the treaty. He just summarily pulls the United States out. That's Donald Trump. Then Biden comes in. Not a peep out of the Biden administration about restoring the treaty. And this is a metaphor for how bipartisan what Dr. King called the madness of militarism, how bipartisan it really is. And one more point, Katie, about U.S. policy towards Ukraine. I think that it's essential for the U.S. to get off its high pony about all this. Yes, what Putin is doing in Ukraine is terrible. What Biden has been doing, and before him Trump, and before him Obama, in supporting the Saudi-led war on Yemen is a massive crime against humanity. According to the UN, almost 400,000 people have died in the 8 years of that war. One of probably the largest cholera epidemic in history. The United States supplying and helping that war to take place with Saudi allies. And what happened a year ago? Biden goes and gives a fist bump to the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. This is the kind of a sick policy that we have. And we may as well name it for what it is, because as I say at the end of this book, War Made Invisible, I quote James Baldwin. He said, "Nothing that can be changed until it's first faced. Not everything that we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless we first face it." And I think hidden in plain sight are the realities that U.S. foreign policy and, unfortunately, a bipartisan approach is that some people on the planet really matter and some people really don't. Some people's grief really matters. Some people's grief really doesn't. That's absolutely central to U.S. foreign policy, what happens on Capitol Hill, what comes out of the Oval Office, and in mass media.